A widow was denied shelter in town until a quiet cowboy built her a home. The dust from her husband's grave had not yet settled when the town turned its back on her. Lily stood on the steps of the general store, the worn floorboards groaning under the weight of her grief. Her black dress, the only one she owned, was already fading, much like the memory of kindness in the eyes of her neighbours. Mr. Gable, the store's proprietor and the town's self-appointed conscience, adjusted his spectacles and cleared his throat, his voice as dry as the dirt street. "I'm sorry for your loss, Lily," he said, the words a hollow formality. "But your husband's credit is now your debt, and it is substantial." Behind him, shelves overflowed with sacks of flour, tins of coffee, and bolts of fabric. A world of comfort she could no longer touch. She had nothing. Her husband, a man praised in Sunday sermons for his charm, had left behind a legacy of handshakes and IOUs, leaving her with an empty larder and a house that was never truly theirs. "Please," she whispered, her voice a fragile thing. "Just a bag of flour, a little salt. I can work it off. I can mend. I can clean." Her plea trailed off as the faces around her hardened. The women who once shared recipes with her now clutched their purses tighter. The men who tipped their hats to her now looked through her as if she were a ghost. She was a widow, and in a town that feared hardship like a plague, she was contagious. "We can't," Gable said, his tone final. "It wouldn't be right. The bank will take the house by week's end. You should find passage somewhere else. Perhaps a city where a woman alone can find appropriate work." The implication hung in the air, thick and foul. Shame burned her cheeks. She turned to leave, her shoulders stooped, the weight of her future an impossible burden. That was when she saw him. He was leaning against the far wall of the blacksmith's, a silhouette of a man against the harsh afternoon sun. Jacob. He was a quiet man who kept to his land on the edge of the wilderness, a place most folks avoided. He rarely came to town, and when he did, he spoke to no one, his eyes holding a permanent shadow of some long-past sorrow. He had been watching, his face unreadable. As she passed, her gaze fixed on the endless dusty road ahead, his voice stopped her. It was low, like the rumble of distant thunder. "You know how to use an axe?" Lily froze, turning slowly. He hadn't moved, his arms crossed over his chest. He was tall, his frame lean but strong, his face weathered by sun and wind. "I can learn," she managed to say. He gave a single, slow nod. "Got a plot of land by the creek. Trees are plentiful, soil's decent." He wasn't offering charity. He wasn't offering comfort. He was offering a chance, as hard and unforgiving as the land itself. "You can build," he said, his gaze unwavering, "if you've got the will for it." She looked from his stoic face back to the closed doors and cold eyes of the town. One offered a swift, quiet end. The other offered a struggle that might kill her just as surely, but it was a struggle she could call her own. "I have the will," she said, her voice finding a sliver of the steel it had lost. Jacob pushed himself off the wall. "My wagon's by the livery. Be there before sundown." He turned and walked away without another word, leaving her standing in the middle of the street with the first choice she'd had since her world fell apart. She chose the axe. The wagon ride was silent. The rhythmic creak of the wheels and the soft snort of the horses were the only sounds that dared to break the stillness between them. Lily sat stiffly on the hard wooden bench, clutching the small bundle that held all her worldly possessions. A spare shawl, her mother's locket, and a worn-out Bible. Jacob's homestead was a lonely outpost carved out of the wilderness, miles from the prying eyes of the town. A simple, sturdy cabin stood against a backdrop of dense pine forest, a plume of smoke curling lazily from its stone chimney. A barn, weathered to a silver grey, leaned slightly as if tired from its long vigil against the wind. The place felt like its owner, solitary, silent, and steeped in a history it did not wish to share. He pulled the wagon to a halt near a narrow creek that snaked through a clearing dotted with tall pines. The water gurgled over smooth stones, a gentle sound in the otherwise profound quiet. "Here," he said, his voice as rough as the bark on the trees. He gestured with his chin toward the flat, open ground beside the water. The ground is firm, close to water, sheltered from the north wind by the ridge. Lily slid down from the wagon, her boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. The air was clean, tinged with the scent of pine and damp soil. It was a wild, untamed place, both beautiful and terrifying. She felt impossibly small, a trespasser in a world that had existed long before her and would exist long after she was gone. Jacob walked to the back of the wagon and pulled out a heavy, single-bitted axe. The handle was worn smooth from use, the head sharpened to a keen edge. He handed it to her, and the weight of it was a shock, a solid, brutal reality in her trembling hands. "There's a saw in the barn," he said, his eyes scanning the tree line. "Take what you need. The forest doesn't mind." He turned as if to leave, then paused. "There's a spring up the ridge. Water's cleaner for drinking." And with that, he walked toward his cabin, his long strides eating up the distance, leaving her alone in the clearing. For a long moment, Lily didn't move. She just stood there, the axe heavy in her hand, the silence of the wilderness pressing in on her. Doubt, cold and sharp, pricked at the edges of her resolve. What did she know of building, of felling trees? She was a woman who had known only the soft life of a town, of needlepoint and kitchen gardens. But then she looked back in the direction of the town she could no longer see, and remembered the scorn in Mr. Gable's eyes, the whispers behind cupped hands. That memory was a fire in her belly. She took a deep breath, the crisp air filling her lungs, and walked toward the nearest pine. Her first swing was clumsy, the axe head glancing off the trunk with a dull thud. Her arms jarred, her hands stung. She tried again, and again, her frustration mounting with each failed attempt. Tears of anger and futility welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back, refusing to let them fall. She would not cry. Crying was a luxury for those who had shoulders to weep on. She had only the unyielding bark of a tree. She worked until her hands were raw and blistered, until her muscles screamed in protest, until sweat soaked through her dress and the sun began to dip below the ridge. She had managed only to hack a pitiful notch into the massive trunk. It was a failure, a testament to her foolishness. Exhausted and defeated, she sank to the ground, the axe falling from her numb fingers. She stared at her hands, at the broken skin and the angry red welts. This was impossible. Jacob had been a fool to offer, and she had been a fool to accept. As dusk settled, weaving long shadows through the trees, she watched his cabin. A light appeared in the window, a warm golden square against the encroaching darkness. He was in there, in his home, while she was out here, with nothing but the cold ground and the looming trees. A profound loneliness washed over her, more chilling than the night air. She was truly alone. The days bled into one another, each one a relentless cycle of back-breaking labour. Lily learned the rhythm of the axe, the bite of the saw, the protest of her own body. She learned to read the grain of the wood, to aim her swings with a desperate precision. Slowly, painstakingly, a pile of felled logs grew in the clearing. It was a monument to her stubbornness. Jacob kept his distance. She would see him in the mornings, heading out to check his fences or hunt, a silent figure moving with purpose across his domain. He never spoke to her, never offered a word of encouragement or criticism. He simply existed, a quiet presence at the edge of her world. Yet things began to appear. One morning she found a new axe propped against the log pile, its head perfectly balanced, its handle smooth and new. There was no note, no explanation. A few days later, a bucket of iron nails and a heavy mallet sat waiting for her by the creek. Then came a length of rope and a block and tackle, left hanging from the branch of a sturdy oak. He never gave them to her directly. They were simply there, offerings left by a ghost. She knew it was him, and this silent, indirect form of help was something she could accept. It was not charity. It was a sharing of tools, a quiet acknowledgement of her struggle. One afternoon, she faced her greatest challenge yet, raising the first wall frame. She had assembled it on the ground, a heavy rectangle of notched logs that seemed to defy the laws of physics. She pushed, she pulled, she used levers, but the frame would not budge. Frustration gnawed at her. She was sweating, covered in sawdust, her hair sticking to her face. She felt a familiar wave of despair wash over her. Just as she was about to give up, to sit down, and finally allow the tears to come, a shadow fell over her. She looked up, startled. It was Jacob. He stood there, watching her, his expression unreadable. She braced herself for a dismissive word, for the quiet judgment she saw in his eyes. But he said nothing. He walked over to the opposite side of the frame, bent his knees, and gripped the wood. "On 3, he said, his voice calm and even. 1, 2, 3. They lifted together. The frame rose, heavy and cumbersome, swaying precariously. Her muscles strained, her breath catching in her throat. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought it would fall, but his strength was a steady, grounding force. With a final, coordinated heave, they set the frame into the foundation stones she had laid. It stood, a wall, the beginning of a home. Lily stared at it, her chest heaving, a feeling of dizzying triumph surging through her. She looked at Jacob, her eyes wide with a mixture of gratitude and surprise. "Thank you," she breathed. He simply nodded, his gaze lingering on the wall for a moment. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back toward his cabin, his silence as profound as his help had been. Lily watched him go, a strange warmth spreading through her chest. In the town, help came with ledgers and judgment. Here, it came with a shared burden and the dignity of silence. That evening, as she laid out the logs for the second wall, she felt a change in the air. The wilderness no longer felt like an enemy. The silence no longer felt like loneliness. It was beginning to feel like peace. The small, one-room structure began to take shape, a testament to Lily's unyielding will. It was crude, the logs uneven, the corners not quite square, but it was hers. It was more than a shelter. It was a declaration. She had not broken, but the town had a long memory and a longer reach. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Lily was chinking the gaps between the logs with a mixture of mud and moss, the sound of an approaching horse made her pause. It wasn't Jacob's steady gelding. This was a different gait, more deliberate, more arrogant. A moment later, Mr. Gable rode into the clearing, his fine town clothes looking absurdly out of place against the wild backdrop of the forest. He reined in his horse and looked down at her, his lips pursed in disapproval. He surveyed the half-built cabin, his gaze lingering on her dirt-smudged face and work-worn hands. "I see you've found a new arrangement," he said, his voice laced with insinuation. Lily straightened up, her back stiffening. "I've found work." Gable chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Is that what he calls it? The whole town is talking, you know. A lone woman, living on a bachelor's land. It's an offense to decency, an offense to your late husband's memory." My husband's memory is my own to keep, Lily said, her voice low and steady, and my decency is not for you or the town to judge. Just then, Jacob emerged from the trees, a brace of rabbits slung over his shoulder. He stopped when he saw Gable, his eyes narrowing. He walked into the clearing, placing himself between Gable and Lily, a silent, immovable wall. Gable shifted in his saddle, his confidence wavering slightly under Jacob's intense gaze. "Jacob," he said, forcing a congenial tone, "I was just expressing my concern. For this poor woman's reputation, and for yours, people will draw conclusions." "Let them," Jacob said, his voice flat. "People's conclusions are their own business." "But it's a moral failing," Gable insisted, his voice rising, "to harbour a woman of questionable circumstance. It reflects poorly on all of us." Jacob took a step forward, and for the first time, Lily saw a flicker of cold fire in his eyes. "The only moral failing I see," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet, "is a town that preaches charity on Sunday and turns a grieving woman out onto the street on Monday. She asked for flour, Gable, not a handout. She offered to work." Gable was speechless, his face flushing a deep red. "This land is mine," Jacob continued, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Who I allow on it is my decision. She is building a home. She is not a burden, and she is not your concern. Now, unless you plan on helping her raise that roof beam, I suggest you ride back to your store and count your profits." He held Gable's gaze for a long, tense moment. The storekeeper, thoroughly cowed, pulled sharply on his reins, turned his horse, and galloped away, his dignity left trampled in the dust. The clearing fell silent again, the only sound the rustle of leaves in the wind. Lily stared at Jacob's back, her heart pounding. He had defended her, not just her presence, but her honor. He had thrown the town's hypocrisy back in its face. She had been so accustomed to fighting her own battles, she hadn't realized what it felt like to have someone stand beside her. He turned, his expression returning to its usual stoic mask. But she saw something else there, a shared understanding. He looked at her work, then at her. "You'll need more mud for that north wall before the first frost," was all he said, before heading toward his cabin. Lily watched him go, then turned back to her wall, a small, slow smile touching her lips for the first time in months. The home she was building felt a little warmer, a little stronger. It was no longer just a shelter for herself, but a sanctuary for two lonely souls. As the days grew shorter and the air sharper, the cabin's four walls stood complete. Lily, with Jacob's silent assistance, had managed to lay a roof of split pine shakes. It was a small, defiant fortress against the coming winter. In a gesture of stubborn hope, she had found a single, resilient wildflower on the banks of the creek and carefully transplanted it into a small patch of earth near her door. It was a spot of colour in a world of grey and brown, a promise that life could persist. One evening the sky turned a bruised purple, and the wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound that promised a bitter night. An early storm was rolling in, the first real taste of the season's fury. Lily was inside, shivering by a small, smoky fire, when she felt the first drop of water hit her cheek. She looked up, another drop, then another. The roof, her proudest achievement, was leaking. Panic seized her. A leaking roof in a drizzle was an inconvenience. In a winter storm, it was a death sentence. The rain began to fall in earnest, drumming against the shakes, finding every tiny imperfection, every gap she had missed. Water trickled down the walls, pooling on the dirt floor. She frantically tried to plug the leaks with rags and moss, but it was a losing battle. The cold seeped into her bones, and the fire hissed and sputtered as water dripped into it. Just as despair began to set in, the door creaked open. Jacob stood there, silhouetted against the stormy dark, his hat dripping, his coat dark with rain. In one hand, he held a hammer, and under his other arm was a large roll of oiled canvas. He didn't say a word. He stepped inside, his presence filling the small space, and went straight to work. He climbed onto the single stool she possessed, stretching the canvas across the leaking section of the roof, his movements efficient and sure. Lily stood by, holding the lantern, its flickering light dancing across his focused face. The storm raged outside, a wild symphony of wind and rain, but inside the small cabin, a different kind of rhythm emerged, the steady, percussive sound of Jacob's hammer. They worked together in the dim light, a silent, coordinated team. She handed him nails. He drove them home. She held the canvas taut. He secured it. They didn't need words. The shared task, the urgent need to fend off the storm, was a language all its own. Hours passed. The storm howled, but inside, the dripping slowed, then stopped. The fire regained its strength, casting a warm, steady glow. Jacob drove the last nail and climbed down, wiping his wet hands on his pants. The small cabin was dry, a sanctuary carved out of the heart of the storm. He looked around the small space, at her meagre belongings, at the firelight glinting on the wet floor. His gaze finally settled on her. She was soaked, her hair plastered to her face, but her eyes shone with a profound, unspoken gratitude. "It will hold," he said, his first words of the night. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He gave a small nod, his eyes lingering on her for a moment longer than usual. The air between them was charged, filled with the intimacy of a shared crisis, of a battle won together. The storm had thrown them together, forcing them to rely on one another, and in doing so, had washed away the last remnants of distance between them. He turned to leave, but paused at the door. "You should get some sleep," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "The worst is over." As he stepped back out into the raging night, Lily knew he was wrong. The worst was over, but something else, something far more complicated and hopeful, was just beginning. The fire crackled, a warm and living heart in the center of the small, dry cabin. Outside, the storm had gentled to a steady, drumming rain. The scent of wet pine and wood smoke filled the air. Jacob had not left. After ensuring the roof was secure, he had returned with a load of dry firewood from his own stack and 2 mugs of steaming coffee, brewed strong and black. He sat on a low crate he'd fashioned, and she sat on her stool, the fire between them a silent witness. The warmth and the shared victory had loosened something within her, a knot of grief and secrets she had carried for too long. "He wasn't a good man," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. Jacob looked up from his mug, his expression patient, waiting. "My husband," she clarified, staring into the flames. "The town saw him as a pillar, charming and generous, but his generosity was with other people's money. He was a gambler. He'd lose the last of our food money on the turn of a card and come home smiling, promising a change of luck that never came." She took a shaky breath. "The debt he left. It wasn't a surprise to me. The surprise was that the town blamed me for it. They mourned the man they thought he was, and cast out the woman who knew the truth." She looked at Jacob, her eyes clear and unashidden. "I don't mourn him. I mourn the life I thought I would have. I mourn being so foolish as to believe his promises." Jacob listened, his gaze never leaving her face. He didn't offer platitudes or pity. He just listened, and his quiet attention was a greater comfort than any words could have been. When she finished, a long silence settled over them, but it was a comfortable, shared quiet. Then he spoke, his voice a low rumble. "I had a wife," he began, and the simple words seemed to cost him a great deal. "Her name was Sarah. We had a daughter, Lily. He paused, his knuckles white around his mug. We built that cabin together, the one I live in now. She planted a garden, said a house wasn't a home without flowers. Lily. She had her mother's laugh. It was like wind chimes. He fell silent again, the pain of the memory a visible thing, carving new lines into his face. There was a fever that winter, he continued, his voice hoarse. It came on fast. I rode for the doctor, but the snow was too deep. The pass was blocked. By the time I got back... He didn't need to finish the sentence. The story was there in the hollows of his eyes, in the permanent winter that seemed to reside in his soul. I buried them on the ridge, together. After that, the house was just walls. The flowers died. I stopped talking to folks. It was easier to be silent than to explain a grief that has no words. He looked up, and his eyes met hers across the fire. In that moment, they were not a lonely man and a cast-out widow. They were two survivors, two souls who had been scoured by loss and had somehow endured. They understood each other's silence because they both knew the language of what was missing. I'm sorry, she whispered, the words inadequate but deeply meant. He shook his head slowly. Grief is a private debt. No one can pay it for you. He stood up, placing his empty mug by the door. The storm has passed. You should rest. He stepped outside, leaving her in the warm, firelit quiet. She looked around at the sturdy walls she had built, at the dry roof above her head. She had come to this place seeking shelter from the world, but in the heart of a storm, in the sharing of old sorrows, she had found something far more precious, the beginning of a home. A week later, the first real blizzard of the season descended from the north, a monstrous, churning wall of white that swallowed the landscape whole. It was not a storm, it was a siege. The wind shrieked like a banshee, piling snow into massive drifts that buried fences and reshaped the earth. Lily was trapped. Her small cabin, which had felt so sturdy, now seemed like a fragile toy against the storm's immense power. Snow pressed against the door, drifted through invisible cracks in the walls, and the world outside her single window was an endless, swirling vortex of white. She kept the fire roaring, using her precious wood sparingly, but the cold was a living thing, creeping in, stealing the warmth. For 2 days, she was a prisoner. The silence was absolute, broken only by the howl of the wind. On the third morning, she woke to an eerie quiet. The wind had died down, but the snow was still falling, thick and steady. Her firewood was gone. The cabin was dangerously cold. A deep, primal fear, the kind she hadn't felt since her first night alone, began to take hold. She was going to freeze. Just as a heavy lethargy began to settle over her, a sound broke the stillness. A thumping, digging sound against her door. Her heart leaped. She scrambled to the door, her fingers numb, and pushed. It wouldn't budge, blocked by a heavy drift. "Jacob!" she yelled, her voice hoarse. The digging intensified. Minutes later, the top of the door was cleared, and it was pushed open from the outside. Jacob stood there, covered in snow from head to foot, his face chapped and red from the wind, his breath coming in white plumes. Relief washed over her so intensely her knees went weak. He had come. He had fought his way through the blizzard for her. He took in the scene at a glance. The dead fire, her shivering form, the frost on the inside of the walls. "Get your coat," he commanded, his voice strained from the effort. He didn't wait for an answer, turning and beginning to clear a path back toward his cabin. She wrapped herself in every layer she owned and stumbled out into the blinding white world. The snow was waist-deep, a vast, undulating sea. The path he had carved was a narrow trench. Following him was a monumental effort. Each step was a battle against the crushing weight of the snow and the biting cold. Her lungs burned, Her legs felt like lead. Halfway to his cabin, she fell, her strength utterly spent. She couldn't get up. "I can't," she gasped, the words stolen by the wind. Jacob turned, came back, and without a word he scooped her up into his arms. She was no light burden, but he carried her as if she were a child, his jaw set, his determination a fierce fire against the blizzard's ice. He kicked open the door to his own cabin and carried her inside, setting her down gently in front of a blazing hearth. The warmth was a shock, a painful, wonderful sensation. He stripped off her frozen outer layers, wrapped her in a thick wool blanket, and pressed a hot mug of coffee into her hands. She drank it, the hot liquid chasing the chill from her bones. She looked around his home for the first time. It was clean, sparse, and masculine, but there were traces of a life lived before the silence. A small, beautifully carved rocking chair sat in the corner, too small for an adult. A faded needlepoint sampler hung on the wall, its stitches proclaiming "Home is where the heart is." His heart wasn't here. It was on the ridge. And now, so was she. Safe, warm. The barrier of land and silence that had separated their two worlds had been erased by the storm. She was in his home. And as the blizzard continued its assault on the world outside, inside, a quiet, fragile thaw had begun. The blizzard raged for 2 more days, imprisoning them in the small, warm cabin. The world shrank to the 4 walls of Jacob's home, the crackle of the fire, and the quiet space between them. For Lily, being inside his house was like reading a private history. Every object told a story of the family he had lost. She saw the faint pencil marks on a doorframe, measuring a child's height. She saw the worn patch on the floor by the rocking chair, where a mother had lightly soothed a crying baby. The silence in the house was no longer empty. It was filled with the ghosts of love and laughter. Jacob was a different man within these walls. He was still quiet, but a subtle tension had left his shoulders. He moved with a familiar ease, tending the fire, cooking a simple stew of rabbit and potatoes, his hands, which she had only known to be calloused and strong, showing a surprising gentleness as he mended a tear in her shawl. They fell into a comfortable, unspoken domesticity. She would sweep the hearth while he split more kindling. He would read his well-worn copy of Shakespeare, a surprising discovery, while she sat in the big armchair by the fire, simply absorbing the warmth and the feeling of safety. The close quarters forced an intimacy that 1,000 conversations could not have achieved. She saw the way he rubbed his temples when he was tired, the way he looked out the window toward the ridge where his family lay, a fleeting look of profound sadness crossing his face before he masked it again. He, in turn, saw her, not as the town's outcast or a damsel in distress, but as a woman of quiet strength. He saw the way her hands, though rough from her labor, moved with grace as she stirred the pot. He heard the soft hum that escaped her lips when she thought he wasn't listening. One evening, as the wind howled its final, defiant chorus, he looked up from his book. "The house is too quiet," he said, the words stark in the firelit room. Lily paused, her hands stilling over the mending in her lap. "It hasn't been this warm in a long time," he continued, his gaze direct and honest. "Not since—" He didn't need to finish. She nodded, understanding. "I don't want it to be quiet again," he said. And it was not a question, but a statement of profound need. "When the snow melts, I don't want you to go back to the cabin. There's room here." Her heart, which she had guarded so fiercely, seemed to beat a new, unsteady rhythm. This was more than an offer of shelter. It was an invitation to step out of the cold, not just of the winter, but of the loneliness that had defined both their lives. She looked from his earnest face to the small rocking chair in the corner, and for the first time, it didn't look like a sad memory. It looked like a space waiting to be filled again. She started, her voice catching. I don't think I could bear the quiet again either. A slow smile touched Jacob's lips, a genuine, unguarded expression that transformed his face, chasing away the shadows. It was the first time she had seen him truly smile, and it was like watching the sun break through the clouds after a long, hard winter. The blizzard had buried her past, her isolation, and his grief. And in its wake, on the clean white canvas of a new world, they had found the blueprint for a shared future. When the sun finally returned, it shone on a world transformed, pristine and silent under a thick blanket of snow. The thaw came slowly, life returning in drips and trickles. As the snow receded, it revealed the scars of the winter, but also the promise of spring. Lily did not move back to her small cabin by the creek. Instead, it became a workshop, a storehouse for tools and seeds. Her life moved into the main house, her presence filling the quiet spaces, her touch bringing a gentle warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. She did not remove the artifacts of his past life. The small rocking chair remained in its corner, but now it often held a basket of mending or a sleeping cat. The needlepoint sampler stayed on the wall, a testament to a love that had come before, a foundation upon which a new love could be built. They began to build their home in earnest. It was not a grand construction, but a series of small shared acts. Together, they repaired the section of barn roof that had sagged under the snow's weight. He taught her how to properly stretch and cure a hide, and she taught him how to bake bread that rose light and airy. They built a sturdy new fence around a patch of land for a garden, their hands often brushing as they worked, sending small sparks of awareness through the simple, shared labour. One morning, Lily went to check on the small, hopeful wildflower she had planted by her old cabin. She expected to find it dead, lost to the frost and the crushing snow, but there, pushing through the last patch of icy mud, was a single, stubborn green shoot. Life had held on. She knelt, touching the small plant with a reverent finger. A shadow fell beside her, and she looked up to see Jacob. He looked at the tiny shoot, then at her, his expression soft. "My Sarah tried to plant roses here for years," he said quietly. "The soil is too rocky, the wind too harsh. They never took." Lily looked at the stubborn little plant. "Maybe it's not a place for roses," she said. "Maybe it's a place for wildflowers. They're not as delicate, but they know how to hold on." He crouched beside her, his presence a solid warmth against the morning chill. "I reckon you're right," he said. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently covering hers where they rested on the damp earth. It was the first time he had touched her with such open tenderness. It was not a touch of passion, but of deep, quiet connection, a promise, a homecoming. The news of their cohabitation eventually drifted back to town, carried on the whispers of a hunter who had passed by. Mr. Gable preached a sermon on the sins of solitude and the temptations of the flesh, but the town's judgment seemed distant now, a faint echo from a world that no longer mattered. Their world was here, on this plot of land, defined by the work of their hands and the slow, steady blooming of a trust that had survived the harshest winter. That evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sky turn from gold to violet, Jacob spoke. "That chair," he said, nodding toward the house where the small rocking chair sat. "I built it for Lily. I never thought there would be a reason for it to be used again." He turned to her, his eyes holding a question he didn't know how to ask. "Maybe now there is," she replied softly, placing her hand over his. And on the quiet porch, with the promise of spring in the air, two lonely souls finally, completely, chose to build a home together. Years passed, flowing as steadily as the creek through the clearing. The homestead was no longer a lonely outpost, but a thriving pocket of life. The small cabin was now a bustling workshop, and the main house had been expanded, a new room added, its windows facing the morning sun. The garden, once a hopeful patch of dirt, now overflowed with vegetables and a riot of wildflowers, their colours a vibrant testament to resilience. The house was no longer quiet. It echoed with the sound of laughter, the pitter-patter of small feet, and the gentle creak of the small rocking chair, now occupied by a dark-haired boy with his father's quiet eyes, and a little girl with her mother's determined spirit. Lily and Jacob's story became a quiet legend in the surrounding hills. Travellers would sometimes see them from a distance, working side by side in the fields, moving with the easy, unspoken rhythm of two people who have become extensions of one another. The town's judgment had long since faded, replaced by a grudging respect, and occasionally a wagon would make its way up the long path, its occupants seeking not gossip, but a bit of the peace that seemed to radiate from the small homestead. One warm summer evening, Lily and Jacob sat on the porch, a comfortable silence between them as they watched their children chase fireflies in the twilight. The air was sweet with the scent of honeysuckle and freshly cut hay. Jacob reached over and took her hand, his thumb tracing slow circles over her knuckles, a familiar gesture that still made her heart feel full. "Do you remember the first day?" he asked, his voice a low, content rumble. "You looked like you were ready to fight the world with nothing but your own pride." She smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I was, and I thought you were just another man ready to watch me lose." "I never wanted to watch you lose," he said softly. "I just wanted to see you win." He looked out at the land they had tamed together, at the home they had built from nothing but will and wood. "You did more than build a cabin, Lily. You rebuilt this place. You rebuilt me." She turned her head, her eyes meeting his in the fading light. "We did it together. We built a place for wildflowers." He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a gesture of profound love and gratitude that needed no other words. They sat like that for a long time, watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast, dark sky. Two souls who had found their sanctuary, not in a place, but in each other. Theirs was a love story written not in letters, but in fence posts and field stones, in every shared sunrise and every storm weathered together. It was a testament to the fact that even after the harshest winter, a home and a heart can learn to bloom again. If this story of resilience and quiet love found a place in your heart, if you believe that a home is built not just with hands but with courage, then you have found your own home here with us. Subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more tales of redemption, grit, and the kind of love that can weather any storm. Please like this video and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story where broken souls find the courage to build a new life together. Thank you for sharing this journey with us. We'll see you on the next trail.